Welcome. My name is Dr. Brian McHugh. I'm here in early September 2024 at the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory campus in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, which is a beautiful place to do scholarly work and research. And we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Anthony Zador speaking with us. Dr. Zador is an MD PhD who initially got his undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley in linguistics and then went on to Yale University to earn an MD PhD before going on to a postdoctoral fellowship at the Salk Institute. Both the PhD and his postdoc were in the neurosciences. Currently, he has a lab here at Cold Spring Harbor that focuses on neuro AI and a burgeoning field at the cross-section of artificial intelligence and neuroscience. And we talked today about all aspects of that, how he got interested in it, the nature of his what his lab looks into, namely his two-arm approach, auditory neural circuitry in the human brain and model brain, and describing the overall connectome of lower model systems from a neural circuitry standpoint, and using that to inform AI. It's a fascinating conversation and very relevant given the recent crescendo of artificial intelligence in the mainstream media. So I hope you get a lot out of the conversation. I know I did. And now we'll get to Dr. Anthony Zador. To dig in a little bit, I just wanted to give, if there's any students listening, a little bit of your background just so people can understand how they might follow in your footsteps if they found that interesting. I thought it was really interesting, your background. You had a BA in linguistics from Berkeley, and that led into an MD PhD at Yale. How did that happen? Like, what happens there?
Yeah, there were a couple steps before even the linguistics BA. So I started off as an undergrad in physics, and my plan was to be a physicist because I like solving physics problems. But pretty quickly, I figured out that although I enjoyed solving the problems, I enjoyed figuring out how fast the ball went down the inclined plane. I actually couldn't care less about the answer.
Yeah.
And around that time, I began to realize I was much more interested in figuring out how people think. And through introspection, I reached a conclusion which I no longer believe, which was that the key to thought was language. And so I was like, well, what's the closest we can get to language? It's linguistics. And it turns out that's not exactly what linguists study. They don't really focus on what we would now call cognitive science, but that wasn't a thing back then.
I see.
So I got the degree in linguistics, but by the end of it, I realized I wasn't going to go on with that.
Not to be totally naive, but what is linguistics as a
so there are lots of different things that people do as linguistics. I actually thought that I still think that the history of languages is cool.
Yeah.
But that's not really, it's just a hobby. I like, isn't it cool that, French is related to Italian? Isn't it cool, that these are both related to, the languages spoken in India?
Yeah.
But I just think that's cool. For some reason that captured it. But mostly what linguists do, at least the kind of linguists that I studied under, they were interested in language as a formal system. So there was a guy named Noam Chomsky, who's now, if anything, better known for his politics, his far-left politics, but he also completely sort of transformed modern linguistics. And he basically had the idea that we should think about language as the set of all sentences that we can generate. This is like an abstract mathematical concept. So, as someone who came from physics, the sort of formal structure of the set of all possible languages seemed really appealing.
I see.
And so what they would do is they would write down sort of very formal, rigorous sets of rules for generating these languages. But in my opinion, it ended up being sort of boring and sterile.
And it wasn't what you were
It
kind of
wasn't. It
core
didn't. It did. It
after.
didn't. It didn't really.
Right.
Again, it appealed. And this will be a theme that I'm always interested in. Sort of mathy, clean, beautiful answers, but they have to be to the right questions.
Yeah.
And so much of my career is going back and forth between interesting questions and satisfying answers. And so they were, to my mind, cool answers to the wrong question.
Is the linguistics start kind of why part of your lab focuses on auditory processing? And
Deeply at some point, yeah, like
yeah,
we can talk maybe later about how I ended up
yeah,
in audition, but yeah,
yeah.
that certainly informed it. I always had this fantasy, which still hasn't happened, that maybe one day I would go back to studying language,
Uh,
but from a sort of neuroscience-y perspective. And so the auditory work was sort of, setting the stage for that.
yeah. Were you heavy math as like a high schooler? Was
So
it?
what ended up so I was very good at math and physics, and I started college very young.
Uh,
And so I was planning when I was like 15 when I started.
sure.
And so I was planning on, going the physics fast track. I had it all planned out. I was going to get my physics PhD by, 21. That was my plan.
What inspired you at that young age to like
Well,
know that far down the road?
my father's a mathematician. My stepfather's a physicist.
Okay,
My
okay.
mom, also had sort of a similar background. My mom was brilliant at languages, so ultimately
Oh,
she
okay.
probably influenced the linguistics a little bit.
Okay.
But yeah, I sort of, in some sense, I went into the family business.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like
So your father's generation of physicists would have been a contemporary of like um Bohr and
not quite. No,
no, they're
no, no,
older.
no, no,
They're
no.
older.
And also my parents and were all from Hungary,
Okay.
so Hungary had a great mathematical tradition.
Right.
So actually, my father did know and hang out with a well-known Hungarian one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, named Paul Erdős.
Mm,
Um,
don't know the name, but
yeah.
yeah.
So how
Yeah.
many mathematicians can
Yeah.
you name?
You
He
know.
is one of the many that most people cannot name.
Yeah, fair
But
enough.
he's famous because most mathematicians stop producing useful work in their 20s.
I was just reading this.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I asked was I'm actually in the middle of reading, and it came up with something else in your bio. um, American
Oh
Prometheus, the
yeah.
Oppenheimer
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
biography, which
Yeah,
is
that's a great
fascinating.
great movie, great book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So they name a lot of personnel
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that, and
So yeah, all those guys are legendary, but
yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough.
Um, but like Erdős was rare in that he continued to produce into his 70s and 80s.
Yeah, okay.
And so my dad knew him, and it was because of him that my dad was able to leave Hungary and actually continue on in math.
It's a random sidebar, but it's such a strange vignette in the book. I mean, they almost treat them like athletes. Like it's like you're past 33,
Yeah,
you're done, like it's over.
yeah, yeah,
And just based on history, you're never
yeah,
going to do anything again. And it's like,
yeah.
whoa, that's
It's crazy.
it's not like they let them go or anything, but they just
They put
assume.
him out to
Yeah,
pasture.
pretty much. It's kind of like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. No, no, and it's funny because I think in math and in physics, you have to come to the field with some brand new perspective,
Yeah,
and that's kind of
that's
enough. You
early
don't need a
on.
lot of knowledge. You need a
Fresh,
brilliant idea.
fresh eyes, brilliant idea.
It's less that way in biology, fortunately. I still think my best work is ahead of me,
Ahead of
so
you, yeah, fair enough.
I'm going to keep thinking of that till.
Did you, when you pivoted, when you went linguistics and then pivoted to MD, PhD, neuroscience, did you get any pushback from your family? Was anyone like, whoa, 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 this isn't physics. What are you, what are you doing?
Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually started applying to an MD program, and then decided to do MD PhD. And my stepfather somewhat jokingly said, "So you're going to be a real doctor after all," which
Interesting.
is
Yeah.
the opposite, of course,
Yeah,
of what.
right.
Yeah,
The word.
yeah.
Um, okay, so you finish up linguistics, and then you're kind of thinking maybe medicine, still with like the background, you're like still focused on neuroscience or
No,
cognitive learning.
actually,
No.
so I actually went into medical school with the idea that I would be a practicing physician.
Uh,
I didn't really have honestly, I didn't have doctors in my family. I didn't really understand what
yeah.
doctors do.
Right.
Um, and I sort of went in because I actually wanted to have a real impact on people's
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
Um, and it was only during a couple of years off that I discovered, before I went to med school, that I
Okay.
discovered neuroscience, and actually not just neuroscience, but artificial neural networks and computational neuroscience.
Oh, interesting.
And so that was actually how I got into neuroscience, is because of what is now called AI, but at the time was just the dawn of artificial neural networks.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So you were exposed to that before you even went
Yeah, I just
in.
picked up some random books in a bookstore, and I was like, this is what I want to do. And so
Uh,
between when I applied to med school and when I got there, that was like, and then I started seeking out people who were doing
who
that kind of
did that
stuff.
kind of stuff? Who was your? And you went to Yale for your
I went
MD
to
and your
Yale for the
PhD.
MD, PhD. Yeah.
I did my residency there.
Oh yeah, it's a great
Where
neurosurgery
the
program.
great neurosurgery
Yeah, yeah,
program
yeah. We
did.
can talk about that because yeah,
Yeah,
like I said, I almost went into neurosurgery, and
some of the when I
I
was
bet it's
there.
some of the same people who I
Oh, it
trained
was
with.
the faculty was sort of not close to retirement when I went through, but they had been there since the 70s for the most
Yeah.
part. Dr. Spencer,
Oh
Dennis
yeah,
Spencer was the
yeah. Dennis Spencer. Yeah,
epileptologist
yeah,
who
yeah.
was
I
there,
remember him.
and Dr. Joe Pietmeyer was
Ah,
the
yeah. He was a
tumor
Pete.
person.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one was Dr. Charles Duncan was the
Duncan. Yeah,
pediatric
yeah. Pediatric.
neurosurgeon.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And if I remember, there was like a Turkish guy,
Turkish guy,
Ahmed, or
yeah, he
he was.
left.
Oh, okay. Because
And his
he was a brilliant resident when I was there.
Okay, okay. His protege ended up staying and is now the chairman,
Oh,
and
okay.
he is a cerebrovascular person, but focuses heavily on the lab. His name's Murat Ganel, and they do. I'm going to butcher this, but genetic studies of aneurysms,
Yeah,
essentially.
no, I
Like,
think he was the guy
oh,
who.
is it okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Murat. Yeah, that's it.
There was another gentleman who Ahmed might be right as the first
No, no,
name.
Murat. Murat. I was getting the name
Is the
wrong.
name
Murat was the
okay?
name. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he was like a third-year resident, and he was already just a rising star and
that's so
super
funny.
impressive.
That's so funny. Yeah, that was a older department when I came through, but they stayed the whole time, and then recently have all I
Yeah,
think all retired. So,
yeah.
who did you do the PhD with?
Yeah, so I got to Yale wanting to do computational
Yeah,
neuroscience and neural networks. And it turns out Yale at that time was not really strong in
doing
that.
that. Okay.
And so I almost transferred to MIT
Okay.
to work with a guy named Tommy Poggio, but then that didn't work out. And then I decided I wanted to work with Tommy Poggio's protege, who is an assistant professor at Caltech, a guy named Christoph Koch.
Okay.
And he had just started his lab, and I called him, and he's this super charismatic, enthusiastic guy. And he's like, "Yeah, Tony, come, spend the summer at Caltech with me." And then I did, and it turned out he had a collaboration with a guy who's just moving to Yale. And so I did a joint PhD with my formal advisor was this guy named Tom Brown, who was at Yale. He's
Okay.
probably close to retirement now.
Okay.
If he might well be retired.
We tried.
Um, and then Christoph.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
Christoph was sort of like my mentor, but I,
Like a
you know,
split institution
yeah,
almost.
I would
Yeah.
spend summers at Caltech, and
Oh, interesting.
we published together quite a bit.
Huh. Um, and you did, for anybody listening who might be a student, if you're doing an MD PhD program, did you, when you did it anyway, was it medical school and then
Yeah,
PhD
so
and
different programs do it differently,
yeah,
and some have very strict rules. Yale was, especially when I was there, was an extremely flexible institution.
yeah, still is, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So among other things, I think I was the last class to have the so-called old system, which was the medical students had no grades, no tests, nothing.
They still have no grades, I
They still have
think.
no grades, but
Yeah.
I think,
Tests now.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think they have something closer to a pass-fail. But when
Okay.
I was there, they had no responsibilities other than to pass each subsection of the medical boards.
Wow.
And they really emphasized research.
Yeah.
So what I did was at the end of the first year, because I was really eager to do research, I did the first year of preclinical classes. Then I entered the lab,
Okay.
and then went back and did the second year, and then entered a clinical medicine after I finished.
After you're done the lab, after you're
Uh,
done the PhD.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that I think, honestly, what I think would have been better would have been to do the full year and a half of preclinical coursework,
Get it out of the
and
way.
then because it was really hard to get
Yeah.
back into it.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
How did they almost pull you into neurosurgery? Was it?
So by the time I got to the wards, I was really deep in the research.
Yeah.
I
Just a
was
break maybe from the.
No. So I was trying to like convince myself that I wanted to do something clinical.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
I still had this fantasy that I
Yeah.
would be able to do both. And so, what was I going to, people are saying, oh, you are going to love internal medicine.
Yeah.
I did not love internal medicine.
Yeah. Right.
They said, you're going to really like neurosurgery, neurology.
Yep.
It's all about puzzles. And apologies to any neurologists out there, but it did not appeal to me.
Yep.
Because what I liked about medicine was that you can intervene and
Yeah.
do something.
Yeah.
And, if I want puzzles, I'm happy with the puzzles that the lab provides. Those are great puzzles.
Yeah.
I'm not a crossword puzzle kind of guy.
Yeah.
And the puzzles of neurology and internal medicine, they're puzzles. They're intellectually, but you kind of like, after a while you get good at them.
Yeah.
And then it's
redundant.
It's redundant.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, like, I was one of those people, which it was a complete surprise to me. The first time I stepped foot in an OR, it was like going to this magical realm.
Right.
And I think a lot of surgeons
Feel
have
that way. Yeah.
And everyone else is like, what? This is awful.
Yeah.
But and it was a complete surprise to me. But my first rotation actually was OBGYN, which is, I think surgeons are sort of iffy about whether that counts as surgery, but like, gowning up and the whole thing, it
got you.
It just got me. And then I wasn't particularly skillful.
It's so funny because I remember talking to a psychiatrist, like a physician scientist, psychiatrist at Georgetown at one point, and he had such an awful memory of the surgical side. He was like, "Oh, you're going to hold the sticks?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He's like, "That's all you do there. You just hold sticks, like these little. They just hand you things to hold, and you hold them, and you stay there for hours." And I hated it, and I'll never go back.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Well, I was
it's true. Yeah,
I had no natural talent there at all, so I wasn't doing anything more than that.
Yeah.
Until what ended up happening was, then I got to neurosurgery, and that was like just the most fun.
Yeah.
Out of all, like it was so real.
It can grab you, I think.
And and also. It is true that some surgeons are not quite as sort of intellectual.
Right.
Like, of course there are exceptions, but like the orthopedic surgeons are not necessarily the most
bone broke.
But the neurosurgeons were all brilliant,
right,
and energetic and accomplished, and so I just got sucked in.
Felt good.
And I just came very close.
Very close, yeah. But you didn't ultimately do it. You went to the Salk Institute.
That's right.
And now I could be wrong on this, but we're here at Cold Spring Harbor Labs in Cold Spring Harbor, and independent research association, same with the Salk Institute. Did you seek out places that were separate from like a huge...
It's a complete coincidence.
Okay.
I ended up at Salk because there was a professor that I had sort of started working with, a really brilliant guy who was at Yale at the time, a guy named Chuck Stevens.
Okay.
So he was this legendary guy, the nicest guy in the world, but also at the time he was one of the dominant figures in all of neuroscience. Like back then, if the New York Times needed a comment on some recent neuroscience finding, they would call Chuck.
Yeah.
Right. He was a member of the National Academy. He had trained a bunch of Nobel laureates. It means, he was really, but he was just the nicest, lowest key guy. And I was interested in part in biophysics, and he didn't teach classes, but he had this he was a brilliant biophysicist, and he had the standing offer that any student who wanted a tutorial could come to him, and he would like do one-on-one. He was incredibly generous with his time,
That's
and
crazy.
so no one took him up on it. But I was
Yeah.
like, "Are you serious?" He's like, "Yeah, sure."
Yeah.
So I would go meet with him like an hour a week for a semester,
Huh.
and we really hit it off. We wrote a paper together based on the things that we did, and when I was done, he was like, "Well, I'm moving to the Salk
Hmm.
because Yale wasn't very nice to him."
Yeah.
Um, but
Politics.
if you wanna come
Yeah.
and do a postdoc with me, it'd be great. And so I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
La Jolla
Yeah.
on the beach,
Yeah. I can't beat that.
brilliant guy. Why not?
How'd that compare to New Haven? Pretty same, pretty much. Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. The surfing was better in
Yeah.
La Jolla than,
Off of
especially
95.
when I was in New Haven. It was yeah,
Yeah.
it was.
I
I
remember.
had a fantastic time, to be clear,
Me too.
but it was a dangerous
Yeah.
place.
It still is, I think. And I remember thinking, oh, it's right on the water. And when I got there, 95 just ran in front of the water. I was like, what? Why did we do that with
No,
the waterfront?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
so you're at Salk, you do the postdoc there, and then is that work is do you continue that work into what your work is now, or was there was a break kind of?
Yeah, so at every point in my compared to many scientists, I have a short attention span.
Okay.
So I end up changing what I do on a pretty regular basis. So for my
Interesting.
graduate work, I did pure theory and artificial, and then that was rare, and I fought for the right to not do experiments.
Huh.
And then at the end of it, I was like, well, I should learn to do experiments. So that's when I went to Chuck's lab. I retooled as an experimentalist.
Huh.
And then I worked on sort of synaptic transmission
Yeah.
in brain slices. And when I finished that, it was great. I had a good time.
Yeah.
But then when I came here, I was like, no, I want to work on the intact animal.
Yeah.
And then I want to work on the auditory system,
Yeah.
which I hadn't worked on. I just sort of randomly
Interesting.
decided that. And then I've changed 3-4 more times since then, which is rare.
Yeah, how does that work? Because when I at least tangentially came up against it, it seemed very much like the funding for the work was iterative. Like you had to have this long history of
Yep.
publishing in that arena,
Yep.
and then the next paper was a slight iteration.
Yep.
And okay, that was good, so we'll give you some
Yep.
funds to do the next one. And
That's right.
how did you manage to pivot? Because that was always a no-no.
Yeah. So I got to say, a lot of what made it possible, well, first of all, luck.
Yeah.
But one thing that has made it possible is Cold Spring Harbor is super supportive of people with new ideas. So at each point in the transition, Cold Spring Harbor sort of helped find philanthropic and other funding to sort of prime the pump. It would have been harder. I think I still would have done it, made some of these transitions, maybe slightly different ones.
Yeah.
But there are tricks to.
Yeah.
Basically, you cannibalize the funding from what you were working on onto the new thing until you're ready to take the leap and get your own funding for the new thing.
Right.
But Cold Spring Harbor definitely sort of has always had this very supportive attitude about that.
That seems like one of the, at least as a student, my observation, that seemed like one of the sclerotic aspects of research. Like, it's like, well, how are we're supposed to be just free thinking and coming up with new ideas, but it's this iterative kind of thing.
So the NIH has tried to address this a little bit, but the NIH rewards you for doing incremental work.
Yeah, incremental,
right?
that's the right word.
You basically, through most of your career, what you want to do is, like, the best way to write an NIH grant, and I give this advice is you've done all the experiments and then you've written the paper, but you haven't submitted the paper yet. Yeah. And you change the tense from the submitted paper, which says we did X, to we will do X, and that's a great NIH grant.
That'll get funded. Yeah.
That one will get funded. Yeah. It's not quite as bad as that always. I mean, I have sort of taken risks and gotten funded, but
harder than
it's a little harder.
Yeah.
And there are special mechanisms, especially these days, for higher risk, the so-called transformative R01. But yes, the funding, that aspect of the funding ecosystem is, I would say, suboptimal.
Yeah, frustrating, right? And so now obviously you're here and you've been here for a while, and this whole idea of kind of neuro AI I wanted to get into a little
Yeah,
bit. Um, your lab, at least like reading through the materials, you've got a component that looks at auditory processing and how decisions are made based on auditory input, and then kind of a second arm, and correct me if this is just framed the wrong way, where you're trying to kind of characterize the entire connectome, if that's the right word, of the mouse model.
right.
And I think some of that is trying to get at, listen, a lot of what's happening in AI, which has really revolutionized in the last fill in the blank year, or at least become public
Yeah,
and catalyzed, a bunch of companies that are trying to create products, was the inspiration for some of that computer networking, or the models that
that's right.
large language models that run most of those programs, was inspired by neuroscience at its root.
Yep,
And a lot of the discussion in the lay press is, look, general artificial intelligence is coming, sort of a sentient artificial intelligence is here. And I think your stance, and that's what I want to ask you about, is it's kind of language processing, which is one piece, and this goes back to your linguistics,
right,
but that's not really
right.
higher
Yeah,
order intelligence. And I maybe if you just want to say,
sure. So, stepping back, right? I studied computational neuroscience and neural networks because I believed, and I still believe, I think it was something that the great physicist Richard Feynman
mm-hmm,
once said, which is um, that which we cannot build, we do not understand.
mm,
So, like, you can think you understand how some aspect of the brain works, how it computes, but you can only really prove that you understand it by building it. And right. So, just as an example, in the 70s and 80s, vision scientists, vision physiologists did lots of recordings. There was a Nobel Prize for it. Hubel and Wiesel won the Nobel Prize.
mm-hmm,
They recorded neurons that are sensitive to edges. And vision physiologists at that time looked at that and said, okay, we understand vision now.
mm,
But there were actual engineers who were like, hold on a second. That's not enough to build an actual machine that can recognize a dog or a tree,
mm-hmm,
right? Like, you can't just put a bunch of edges together and produce a system that actually does something useful. So um, that was sort of a clear demonstration that if you don't actually put into practice your theory of how a bunch of neurons get together to compute, then it's really not doing anything. So that's why that sort of logic was what I went into neural networks with. But at the time, this was in the late 80s, early 90s, neural networks couldn't do anything useful.
uh.
And the question was, for me, still is the question, uh, how I'm gonna move out of the sun a
We're
little
getting
bit.
bug bombed.
Well, the bugs and
Oh,
then the
sun. We get sun.
sun.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
The question was, how um, can we improve neural networks by taking inspiration from biological systems, which are
Mm.
vastly outperforming these artificial
Artificial.
systems?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started studying the auditory system, I was at one level answering a biological question, a deep neuroscience question, which is, how does a neural circuit in a mouse or a rat or eventually a human get a sound and process that sound and make a decision about it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concrete, straightforward
Yeah.
neuroscience question. But the sort of deep motivation was, look, if we really understood that, then we could build systems that process sounds, that process vision,
Uh-huh.
and that was how I started. And so we innovated a couple of things, which we figured out how to train rats to perform more interesting, and then mice how to perform more interesting tasks. But by the mid 2000s, it became increasingly clear to me that if we really wanted to understand the circuitry at the level of the individual components, we needed better tools for actually knowing what the circuit was.
Hmm.
And at that time, there was really only one or two good tools for figuring out circuitry. You could either get one neuron at a time
Mm-hmm.
to figure out where it went.
Mm-hmm.
That seems pretty slow.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative is you could get all the neurons in principle by using serial electron microscopy. But the problem was that that involved taking a brain, cutting it into slices that are like 10 nanometers, 20 nanometers thin, and then imaging them and then
Tracing
lining
them.
them up. And it turns out that that's incredibly technically challenging.
Yeah.
And there was a project that I was sort of peripherally part of for cost $50 million,
Mm.
and we got 1 cubic millimeter of a mouse brain.
Wow.
And the cost is going to go down, but that also does. So I
Yeah.
developed a new technique
Yep.
based on molecular biology that sort of has the throughput that you might need, not quite the precision of electron microscopy, but we think it's a useful piece. So that was how I did this connectomics thing. But the backstory for that is that when all is said and done, what makes us us are the connections in our brain.
Mm-hmm.
Which neurons are connected to which other neurons? From my point of view, that defines who we are,
Mm-hmm.
and that connectivity map, right? I think that there's what's special about us is that connectivity map. So if we could figure out either um, what that connectivity map is or the rules that give rise to it, the how we wire up, how we the how that brain is actually wired up, that would provide us the kind of insight that we need to build better systems. And so the idea is that there are a bunch of things that biological systems still do infinitely better than
Mm-hmm.
any physical system. And this is the basis of the NeuroAI program. And so I mean, I can tell you some of the things, some of the potential big payoffs of neuro AI in terms of like how it's going to lead to much better AI and how it's going to overcome the current limitations, which I think are very real.
Very real. Yeah, I thought it was interesting reading one of your papers where you're arguing for, instead of the most common attributes people think of when they think of quote
Yeah.
intelligence, abstract thought,
Yep.
reasoning, kind of human type qualities, why not go back to more basic fundamentals that ultimately develop that,
Yeah.
and study those, which is very much a principle in science, right? Like when we were trying to learn genetics, Mendel started dealing with peas, and then many of the
Exactly.
work was done in fruit flies. It's like no one thought to try and tackle the human genome
That's right.
right off the bat.
Yeah.
And so I guess it sounds like, because we understood language and because language what was available for large language models, those are the first generative AI
Yeah, so
systems we have.
you can even go back a little bit. There's something called Moravec's paradox.
Mm.
Goes back 40 years. Moravec was an AI researcher and a roboticist, I guess in the 80s. And it's a wonderful quote. I can't quite quote it off the top of my head, so you look it up on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
But basically what he says is he already noticed, and others had already noticed by the mid 80s, that what computers find easy often are things that humans find particularly hard or uniquely human, and vice versa. So when people first invented computers, right, they thought, okay, look, what computers are going to be able to do immediately is talk because kids talk.
Oh.
And there's no reason we shouldn't be able to use them to control robots to pick stuff up. Things like, intellectual pursuits like chess, that's going to be hard. Well, of course, that turned out not to be the case, right? Like
Yeah.
the first chess playing computer beat Kasparov in, I think, 97. And, a computer based Go was a somewhat harder game, beat the world champion, I think, in 2016, right? So the things that are uniquely human, chess, Go, poker, language, right? Not uniquely human, right? Those turns out machines can do easily. The things that we take for granted turn out to be incredibly hard. Like we barely have a robot that can pick up this glass of water.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Self-driving cars, such a limited domain.
Yeah.
And yet
So hard, right?
So hard, borderline. still,
Hasn't
there's
been delivered
Waymo
yet.
and a
Yeah.
couple of, but you have a Tesla.
Yeah.
I had a Tesla. I
Yeah.
don't know if you trust the
Nope.
self-driving. Yeah, exactly. It's fun to do, but it's white knuckle driving when you got the self-driving on,
Yeah.
right? I do it for fun. I don't know if you
Yeah.
do
No,
it.
I don't even do it.
Oh, I do it, but I'm very vigilant,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm just curious as a
What it'll
researcher
do.
what mistakes it's going to make.
Yeah.
But I would not trust it with my life, much less my kids'
Yeah.
lives. So why is it that those things are hard? Because and yet there you can watch there are videos of an orangutan driving
Right.
a little go kart around. So
Yeah.
and I suspect it wouldn't be that hard even to train a dog
Right.
with different pedals to
Right.
drive a car.
Yeah.
So why is it that and what dogs and cats and squirrels and spiders do, all those things, interacting with or climbing trees, spinning webs, we are not close to being able to make artificial systems that can do any of that.
Yeah.
And we don't that means that we don't have the basics,
Right.
right? And so that sort of is part of what neuro AI can provide. And if we don't have the basics, then we're not going to be able to do the more like what we have, language, right? That evolved in the last 100,000 years. It's like the sprinkling on the icing of the
Yeah.
cake.
Mm-hmm.
It's tasty,
Yeah. Right.
but it's not the cake.
It's right. And that was interesting in one of your papers talking about what about the attributes that build into intelligence that have 500 million
Yes,
years of
right.
evolutionary history behind
Yeah,
them, and what are the cellular or neuroscientific mechanisms that underpin those,
right.
and can those be instructive to
Yeah.
AI? Is
So
it
so that's exactly the research program from my lab and other labs that are interested in this neuro AI idea. Now, I will say that it's a small minority of people who work in AI, because right now this is a golden age for AI,
yeah,
and there are an amazing number of. I use ChatGPT and
yep,
Claude every day. Super cool,
yeah,
right? Amazing, blows me away,
yeah,
right? And that's going to keep progressing.
yeah,
ChatGPT 5 may be better,
yeah,
right?
right,
But it's not going to. I don't think. I certainly don't believe that without fundamental new ideas, the current trajectory will get us to any of the things that we just talked about. There are some researchers who think there's a famous quote from a researcher at DeepMind: "Scale is everything. It's all about scale."
uh-huh.
I don't think that's true.
Kind of
Um,
scaling up large
yeah, so the
language
difference between
models.
GPT-3 and GPT-4 is scale.
Yeah.
They basically just trained it with more data, ran it on. Do you know how long it takes? It costs for GPT-4. The estimates are that it costs about $100 million to train it,
Hmm.
and the larger ones will cost $1 billion
To train.
to train.
Wow.
A
I
lot
did
of
not
that,
know that.
yeah, and a lot of that money is actually energy costs.
Yeah.
And this is another one of the advantages of AI. Like our brains use 20 watts.
Yeah.
A single GPU, which is the workhorse of these models, takes, I believe, I don't want to.
Yeah.
It's in the kilowatts. So
Oh,
orders of
wow.
magnitude. Orders of magnitude. I think it's 5,000 kilowatts.
So we're more efficient by a long
Orders
shot.
of magnitude more efficient.
Mm.
And we know how neural systems work. They neurons communicate with each other using spikes.
Yeah.
But we don't know. We know that as a fact because we can observe it.
Yeah.
But we don't know the algorithms
Mm-hmm.
that actual neural systems can use to compute with spikes. And so I think that's another sort of frontier and potentially huge contribution of neuro AI. How do you compute in this energy efficient regime?
Yeah, that's an interesting little caveat I hadn't really kind of picked up on.
That is like the amount of energy that these large language models use is a line item now in the world energy budget.
Yeah.
Google search, right? There was talk early on of large language models either replacing or at least supplementing Google search.
Mm-hmm.
One of the limitations, they're getting over it, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the limitations is that just the cost, because of like watts
Yeah.
of a single ChatGPT or Gemini enabled
Search
search
item
is, I think, an order of magnitude more
than just the internet.
just than the standard Google search.
That's pretty fascinating.
And if you're Google, that
That's a big deal,
That's a big deal.
especially in the with the climate change issue
Yeah,
coming
exactly.
down from a
Yeah, yeah,
regulatory
yeah.
standpoint. And then one of the things you talk about is developing, kind of using a more primitive model and trying to essentially understand the structure function equation of the neural circuitry there, and to then be able to reproduce that virtually.
Yeah,
And the idea being, kind of back to what you said earlier, if we can reproduce, say, a mouse
yeah,
based on how its brain is connected and wired, if we can produce a virtual mouse that behaves in the
right.
same way, that journey of doing that will reveal deeper insights into what can be used for
Yeah.
potential
Yeah,
artificial
exactly. I
intelligence.
mean, humans are very impressed with themselves
Yeah,
and all and not only are individual humans impressed with their
their
individual
own
selves,
selves.
but like, we as a species, we think we're fundamentally different, but
The
we're
Earth was the
not.
center of the universe
Yeah,
for
exactly. In the same
thousands
way
of
that
years.
that's
Yeah,
right. That's right. In
yeah,
the same way that we thought that the Earth was the center of, it's not,
yeah,
right? This
yeah.
we're, it's not our star isn't even particularly impressive.
Right, right.
In the same way, humans, we clearly do some cool things, but it's just a tiny increment
Yeah,
over what happened before us,
right,
and it's probably not our intelligence. So
right.
this is something that's underappreciated. People think that the reason humans have become like the dominant species on the planet is our intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably not right.
Hmm.
What the reason that we've become the dominant species on the planet is that because of language, we can accumulate experience over generations in a way
Mm-hmm.
that we can undergo cultural evolution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, which is not unrelated to language, but frankly, it's not clear that even what enables us to have language is our intelligence. So
Mm-hmm.
gorillas, you can't teach them to speak.
You cannot.
You cannot.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just they don't have vocal cords, because people have taught gorillas to use sign
Fine,
language.
yeah.
But when you teach a gorilla to do sign language, it can learn a couple thousand words, a couple thousand signs, but it doesn't produce fluent sentences. It doesn't
Yeah.
have grammar.
Right.
So, but I think most likely there's like a little module that we have, a little brain module that evolved probably over very quickly,
Yeah.
not necessarily linked to intelligence, that enables us to produce language. And that was the key insight, that the key sort of evolutionary advance that enabled humans.
And it's almost, correct me if you think this is wrong, it's the survival benefit of the social nature of species like humans. Now prior to civilization, you've got 100 humans in a tribe, and,
Yeah,
and so you're communicating with them and problem solving and adapting with that many minds, kind of taking in information and processing it. Once you have language, you're going back eons, right? You're
exactly.
actually, even though you might be there with 100
That's
people,
right.
you're actually there with tens of thousands of people over tens of thousands of
That's
years,
right.
because it's all
And
been
the
passed
reason
down.
it's gotten exponential is that, as
Population.
populations have grown, we now accumulate, we
Yeah.
filtered out the importance, and then, of course, writing
Yeah.
sort of amplify that even
Yeah.
further.
You said something, I might forget it here, but you said you're not sure that our intelligence is what allows speech. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so um, we have dedicated circuits that enable us to engage in fine motor control.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you would not be a successful neurosurgeon if you didn't have those fine motor circuits
Mm-hmm.
that enabled, and that. No offense, but that's not necessarily a reflection of
Right.
intelligence. um,
Understood.
that is a reflection of some special circuitry that all humans got.
Right.
We have it more than a gorilla.
Right.
Um, but it's not intelligence per
I
se,
think I understand what
right?
you mean.
It's the ability, we have this special circuitry that allows us to control the individual digits and certain patterns and whatnot. In the same way, we somewhat less characterized, but we almost certainly have specialized circuitry that allows us to produce sentences one after the other, with nouns and verbs in rapid succession and have that. So that could a mouse have? I don't know if a mouse could, but gorillas definitely have the basics of what you need for that in the same way that they have the basics of manual dexterity. They just don't have it quite as developed.
Is that something, not to get too philosophical, but when you take that to its extreme, doesn't it beg the question of, is there intelligence, or is there just sort of, it's difficult.
It's a great question. No, the more you try to define intelligence, the clearer it becomes that it's not a well-defined entity.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, actually,
Yeah.
in kind of reviewing everything for this, the whole idea of intelligence versus consciousness was sort of in the back of my mind, and it's like, well, wait a minute, what is the difference? And that's a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, okay. So yeah, consciousness and intelligence are almost certainly quite different.
Okay.
There are plenty of people, and although a lot of what really got me interested in neuroscience was a desire to understand what consciousness is. I don't think I'm any closer to understanding what it is than I was when I started. In fact, the guy I work for as a graduate student, Christoph Koch, he's devoted much of his career to trying to understand consciousness. He and Francis Crick were close collaborators. In fact, Francis was at the Salk Institute. Francis Crick, as in the double helical structure of DNA.
One of the founders, right? Or he was there in the 60s.
He was there in the 60s. Yeah. So, but for his last 30, 40 years of life, he worked on trying to understand consciousness. And a lot of that work was done with Christoph. And I've read his works, and he's got lots of interesting speculation, but if I'm going to be honest, I don't think, no offense, Christoph.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. How do you think of intelligence versus consciousness? Like, when if you had to explain that to a golden retriever.
There's consciousness and self-consciousness. I think, there's a sort of awareness that we are conscious, but then there's something that precedes that. So we spend most of our day sort of not thinking about our consciousness, and yet I think we're still conscious. Many people never even think about whether they're conscious, right? This is a sort of philosopher's question, or neurosurgeon's question.
Right, yeah.
Presumably that had something to do with what, at some level, what got you interested in this stuff.
Some degree, yeah.
But most people get through, and there are plenty of people, and I'm among them, who think that my dog has some degree of consciousness.
There's a consciousness there, yeah.
And maybe octopuses,
right?
And maybe, so I don't know, I'm hesitant I'm not a dualist. I don't believe we have a soul.
Yeah.
I believe whatever we have comes out of our brain, but I can't define it. Intelligence, though, the way most people use it on a regular basis, which is the ability to solve problems or something like that. I mean, all animals have that to some degree. There is a spectacular book, really wonderful book. If you want someone really interesting to interview, a guy named Max Bennett wrote a book called A Brief History of Intelligence.
Okay.
The best book on the intersection of AI, neuroscience, and evolution that I've read. I will say it was very irritating because he has no business writing such a good book.
Yeah.
He's self-taught.
Oh, wow.
He was a math undergrad at Wash U, and then started some companies, and then became interested in AI, and went and read a lot of neuroscience, and he wrote just the best synthesis of this. So one of I think the key components of he argues, and this makes perfect sense, of intelligence is the ability to run mental simulations. To what would happen if, right, I did this. And that, I think, is a lot of what is responsible for sort of setting the foundation for intelligence. But if you think about it, a great deal of our problem solving comes from seeing analogies to problems that others have solved.
Yeah.
And that comes again from language. So, if we had to solve all these problems from scratch, we would get nowhere.
Yeah,
right?
And wouldn't survive.
Sure, we do these mental simulations, but we're not solving nearly as many problems on our own as we think we are. We're what is it about standing on the shoulders of
Yeah.
giants.
Yeah.
So we are not standing on the shoulders of giants. We're standing on the shoulders of tens of thousands of generations of midgets
Yeah.
is what
Right.
we're doing.
Right.
But that makes us just as tall, if not taller.
I don't know if this question goes too far down the same vein, but given the nature of your work, is intelligence separable from consciousness?
That's going to be a great question, right?
Yeah, it's one
Because
of these endless
no,
questions.
I mean, like, and I think that's a question that we might have to start thinking about for with AI,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
What does it mean? Yeah.
we can still quibble about whether ChatGPT is really intelligent. It can solve a lot of problems,
Yeah.
but I'm pretty darn sure that in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have systems that can solve almost any problem that we can solve, and probably many more that we can't.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, by sort of the classic measures, more intelligent than we are.
Yeah.
Whether that system will be conscious, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then whether, as we typically sort of, this gets into a whole other set of questions about morality, right? We
Yeah.
haven't had to really think hard about, what who do we sort of put under the umbrella of organisms or agents or entities that we treat or feel compelled to treat in a moral fashion.
Yeah.
I think most of us would agree that you should treat fellow humans that way. Many people think that animals deserve some, perhaps not quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some people argue that we're going to need to be treating AI systems
Mm-hmm.
in a moral way. I'm not one of those people,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard for me to, at least at this point, like I'm okay with turning off the computer.
Yeah. Right.
But some people think you shouldn't.
Right. Or when the neuro AI world, the community meets at conferences and whatnot, how much of this type of, how philosophical do you guys get, or does it stay pretty technical and in the lab based?
Over beers, this is 80% of the
80%.
conversation, right?
Yeah.
On the public forum, relatively little, because this is a beer discussion,
It is.
because we're not moving forward.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like, I'm just curious what you think. You might be curious what I think.
Yeah.
Occasionally,
But no one's writing an abstract with the
but
title.
I'm not going to convince you.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
I can't. That's not 100% true, because there is a field called the neuro AI ethics, or AI ethics, AI alignment.
Mm-hmm.
And those people worry a lot about many of these ethical issues,
Mm-hmm.
mostly from the point of view of how do we make sure that AI doesn't destroy humanity.
Right. Yeah.
Or what I'm not so worried about that, but I am worried about disrupting society, which it will do. So some people worry about the Terminator scenario.
Right. Right.
No, there are serious people
for sure.
who worry.
Yeah.
I happen not to be. I think that's unlikely.
Uh-huh.
But the idea that if you have a machine that can perform any work that a human can perform, then how are we going to run a society where people no longer are paid for their labor?
Yeah. Yeah. All types of questions
Yeah.
come up, and then I guess if that's a sentient machine that
and if
wants
it's a
to protect
sentient
itself,
machine, like, again, that I'm not in that camp. But like what
Yeah.
we are, like, if we have, like, the most immediate concern is economic.
yeah,
If we have machines that can do what humans can do, then why would you pay a human to do that?
yeah,
And if you're not paying humans to do that, then how do humans get money?
yeah. And what are they doing?
And
with
what are
their
they
time?
doing?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Why are we all
exactly.
here?
Yeah.
One of the ways you worded kind of the idea of going back to simpler systems or evolutionarily more primitive behavioral patterns and understanding those, the neurocircuitry there, to flush out more knowledge from the standpoint of moving forward with AI, was the higher order functions like abstract reasoning, etc., were supported by a more basic structure. And presumably there's quote intelligence in those more basic structures if they're supporting higher order structures. Can you talk about what you mean by how
Yeah.
a more primitive,
Yeah.
like, is there intelligence in a sensory motor kind of
Okay.
behavior?
So we can look at this either evolutionarily or in us,
Mhm.
right? So evolutionarily, right, you had very simple organisms
Mm-hmm.
like worms,
Yeah.
and they only had to make some very simple decisions,
Yeah.
right? They have to go left and right. They have to go toward food or away from it, or away from predators.
Yeah.
Really straightforward stuff, okay? And that's like the beginning of these systems, right?
Yeah.
And we have brain structures that are kind of like echoes of those earliest structures.
Yeah.
And in fact, Max Bennett's book goes through a wonderful sort of description of how, over 4 or 5 breakthroughs, we went from very simple creatures like worms to fish. What was the evolutionary breakthrough there? Up to mammals, up to primates,
Yeah.
and then up to humans.
Yeah.
But in each case, what you have is a set of earlier brain structures that solve a related set of problems, as well as they can,
Mm-hmm.
and then you don't get rid of those old ones,
Right.
right? You overlay new ones that sort of interact with them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we have reflexes, right? And those solve some of the most important problems on a very fast time scale,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like just again, you know this better than I
Yeah.
do, but like,
Milliseconds.
right, like
Yeah.
your reflexes are there to help adjust your gait, and if you don't have those reflexes, right, all that top down stuff by itself ain't going to be enough,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but then we do have this top down stuff that tells the muscles when to contract,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then at the level of your motor cortex, right? Typically, the command from the motor cortex is not going muscle by muscle, contract this, contract that. It's more like saying, let's head in that direction. Let's pick
Yeah.
this up, and it's handing off sort of the decisions about how to do all those things to all the substructures that were sort of evolutionarily older.
Right.
So, there's this sort of always this process of these sort of more recent, more sophisticated processes that are embodied in brain structures that then interact with the older ones in really
Mm-hmm.
interesting, complicated ways, which frankly we don't really know how to do in artificial systems,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Like it's a hierarchical
It's a
structure,
hierarchical structure.
and you've almost taken the parlor trick of language,
Yeah,
and you said, "Well, look what we can make it do." And it's like, but the
that's
substance isn't there
that's a
because
really
it's
good
not.
way of thinking about it,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
It's a parlor trick
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
because it's not overlaid on all this other stuff, and so
Right.
it's amazing. Like
It's amazing stuff. Yeah.
it's amazing stuff. I would not. In fact, I literally, was placing bets down to say that without this basic stuff, we're not going to get language. And to my surprise, we got
Clear
language.
language. Yeah.
But I still will place other bets down that without doing it the right way, bottom up, we're not going to get the rest of the stuff that's required for interacting with the
Yeah.
world.
The stuff that's harder to
The
find,
stuff that's
maybe,
harder. Yeah.
or we
No.
don't know. We don't know the.
Yeah. Yeah. And how to put that together, how to even get these pieces to these, various, how to build that kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Because it's not a strict hierarchy, of course.
Yeah.
These different brain regions interact in
Yep.
complicated ways.
Yep.
Starts with the hierarchy.
Yep. And why not study the simpler system?
Yeah,
before you-
yeah. So why don't we get the basics down?
Yeah. I wanted to just talk quickly about you guys. Your lab had just published a paper in Nature, which is a very obviously prestigious journal, and I was trying to understand that to some degree, but it was fascinating. And I'll do a terrible job summarizing it, but essentially using high throughput transcriptome processing, meaning you can look at individual cells and see what their sort of transcriptome profile looks like, and use that as a lens through which to view the developing mind. Used a mouse model,
Right.
and then you're sort of overlaying, maybe that's the wrong term, but comparing that to sort of cytoarchitecture or microcircuitry and saying, okay, are little areas that look physically or anatomically similar also sort of similar in the standpoint of their genetic profile or what genes they're expressing? Is that an accurate
Yeah. So
kind of, and what did that, I guess maybe the bigger question is, what were in your mind, what were the big take-home points from that study? Because obviously,
yeah.
complex study.
So we developed this technology for high throughput sequencing that was related to what I was telling you earlier about for high throughput connectomics. It turns out that I won't go into the details, but it was basically the same technology. And we realized that that technology for sequencing the barcodes that we use to figure out connectivity could be co-opted and would work really well for sequencing individual genes.
Huh.
And so we sort of scaled that up, optimized it a little bit, and we ended up with a technology that would allow us to look at the gene expression of 1 million cells in a single mouse brain, in
Whole
a whole
organism?
mouse brain. Well,
Yeah.
we had to cut
You
it
cut
up
it.
into
Okay.
pieces, but slices. And so, why is that interesting? Well, the reason that's interesting is that the mouse brain, like our brain, consists not of just one type of neuron, but of dozens and hundreds of different types of neurons. And we can identify what type of neuron is where by looking at the genes they express.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in turn, also gives us insight into their function and into their connectivity. And also, and this is what led to a company that I co-founded, also into what goes awry when these circuits are disrupted in either neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's,
Mm-hmm.
or neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular paper, we used a sort of artificial um, perturbation, and we showed that you could use this as a very sensitive measure of what happens when you change the inputs, the visual inputs, early in development to a mouse brain. Turns out certain types of cells change their profile. But in the context of this company, Cahal, which is based in Seattle, we've been using it to find new treatments for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. That's
Oh,
the
wow.
goal.
Huh. That's really cool.
So this is, that's not my day job, but
Yeah.
luckily I have a former student who's now the CEO of that company, who's absolutely brilliant, and
He's going to take it.
his focus. He's one of the developers of this technology.
Does I don't know if what the answer to this is, but does that paper, what you were showing there, does that fit into the effort to sort of fundamentally understand a lower organism, ultimately the instructions
Yeah,
for
I
wiring
should
up?
just say that I'm happy to call a worm a lower organism,
Yeah.
but if you look at a slice of mouse
Yeah, it
brain
looks pretty similar to ours.
and you throw away the scale bar,
Yeah.
very few people can distinguish a mouse brain in cross section or
Right.
in a small cross section from a human brain.
100%.
So at the cellular, at even the small circuit level, they're very similar, which is one of the reasons that we study them,
Yeah.
right? Because basically we think that there's actually not that much that has changed
Mm-hmm.
from. So yes, we're interested in these circuits. We're interested in how these cell types wire together, which cell types wire to which cell types.
Yeah.
Um, but
And this is a way that paper was a great way of being able to do that at scale,
at
I would
scale,
imagine.
it was
Yeah.
partly a proof of principle.
Yeah, right.
It was largely a proof of
That's what it
principle.
sounded like for
Yeah,
me.
it
Yeah.
was largely a proof of principle. I mean, we could go into some of the specific findings, but the reason that, and I'll spare you, the reason it appeared in a high-profile journal was less because of the specific discovery that we made, and more because of the demonstration that now this is something that our lab and any other lab that we share this technology, we're excited to share it with any other lab, that
Mm-hmm.
other labs can do. And many other labs now are using this and sort of related technologies. And there's all sorts of, that's a very active field.
And it's a bit of a tool to
It's a,
hopefully get to the point where,
exactly.
listen, we understand the full instruction
That's right.
booklet on how to
Yeah.
build one of
So
these.
basically the idea is that neural circuits are wired up according to which types wire up to which other types.
Yep.
And so knowing what types are where tells us a lot about who's connected to whom and the logic by which these circuits process information.
There was a line in one of the papers that confused me, and it's
Only
around
one?
this wire by similarity
Oh,
concept. And I'm going to butcher this too, but it said something like, it's not just that similar neurons, we're not just looking at which neuron types or neuronal types wire with other neuronal types at a large scale. It's wire by similarity taking into account their transcriptome? Is that?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting. So that's a new that is actually the new sort of conceptual idea that came out of this paper. It's an idea. It remains to be to be tested in other systems. But the idea is that um, neurons that are similar transcriptomically
Uh-huh.
tend to wire together, and so we found these.
Regardless of their microanatomy
Yeah,
or
so we
subtype.
found these sort of brain modules
Uh,
that that we wouldn't have been able to pick up if it
got it.
hadn't been for this. And what we found is that within the module, the connections are much denser than between modules.
So anatomic modules have been known from
Yeah,
the microcircuitry work
yeah.
to look at them, look
And
at their
these are
transcriptome.
similar. The actual modules that you get out are similar, but this provides, if you like, a new way of sort of addressing where those modules came from,
Cool.
why they
Yeah.
arose, maybe
Yeah.
a deeper mechanistic explanation for at least, if not why they arose, how they arose.
And then maybe just to come full circle on that, you've talked before about, kind of your feeling that there needs to be a push in this neuro AI kind of space where folks who have a background in computer science
Yeah,
are also facile with neuroscience,
yeah,
and there really isn't that.
yeah,
So, for example, and you give this example, the AI community kind of picked up the visual cortex microcircuitry knowledge, but that's now 30 years old, and they're sort of stumbling across
yeah,
it. And like, we
exactly.
can't really have that gap. Like, why should we
That's
have that
right.
gap?
Yeah, yeah. So what ended up happening? So when I was in graduate school, um, both fields were a lot smaller,
Mm-hmm.
but also those fields were a lot tighter. So I was a computational neuroscientist, but I did artificial neural networks,
Hmm.
and basically those weren't two distinct hats.
Yeah.
The people I went to graduate school with, my closest colleagues at meetings, you know, they were both.
Yeah.
Some of the people that I went to those meetings with, right? In fact, a couple of them who were just a couple years ahead of me are now sort of, the people who did the foundational work that gave rise to all of modern AI. So
Uh,
Jeff Hinton, Jan
mm,
LeCun, um, Joshua Bengio are the so-called godfathers of AI.
mm,
Um, Jan is, for example, or you stepped down recently as the head of AI at Meta, aka Facebook.
mm-hmm.
Um, Jeff Hinton was at Google. They're winners of the Turing. So these guys, right, who went on to do the absolute foundational work in AI, they were doing that work at that time in the context. They were all inspired by neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking. I knew more neuroscience. I was sort of more neuroscience heavy, but I was interested in that stuff. They were more AI heavy, but they were interested in neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying I was the one who told them, but
Yeah.
as part of this community, we're all
Yeah.
part of a community that has since changed,
Huh.
right? Because now the ideas that they were foundational in providing took on a life of their own, and now it's an engineering field.
Sure.
And the
You're
kids,
commercializing it,
yeah, the
and
kid,
yeah,
and that's not to say that you can't. There's obviously a lot of
room for that, I
room
guess.
for that,
Yeah.
but the fundamental breakthroughs have historically almost always come from sort of going back to the neuroscience and saying, well, what are we still missing? Because our goal is ultimately, at least the goal for many people in this field, is to produce something that I don't care for the term, but it's evocative, um, artificial general intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we are the definition,
Mm-hmm.
like, of what that is. If you before you make the superhuman intelligence, you want to at least make
Yeah.
the human intelligence.
That seems like a more hopeful message, though, because some of the mainstream discussions of it almost make it seem like kind of what we were just talking about with the physicist. Like, we're done here. Like,
Yeah.
we've made AI, and AI will kind of make itself better, and
So
don't go into the field because it's like you'll never be able to catch up with the actual AI
yeah.
units.
So
And
I mean, so there is that hope, right? There's I think it was Kurzweil, if I don't know if he's the one who first came up with it, but he certainly popularized it. Um, the idea that at some point AI will be smart enough to make the next generation of AI, which
Right.
will then make an even smarter next
Yeah.
generation of AI.
Maybe,
Maybe
but there's a lot of work to be done.
I feel like there's a lot of work to be done, and until we get there, it's still sort of engineering.
If a student approached you today and said, I read the paper and I really want to have, computer science and neuroscience be the kind of the nexus of where I work, is there somewhere you'd refer them to? Are there universities who've said, okay, we're going to make a joint program?
I mean, there are a lot of programs now for interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary stuff.
Hmm.
I think right now in computer science departments, they're not typically that focused on bringing in the
Neuroscience.
neuroscience. On the other
Yeah.
hand, neuroscience departments are super enthusiastic about students who not only learn the basics of neuroscience, but also computer science,
Yeah.
and in particular, the machine learning part
Yeah.
of
I could
computer
see that.
science. But I guess I'll add to that um, we don't know where the new best idea is going to come from.
Yeah.
And so the best thing to do is, there are so many things you would like to learn, and no single person can learn them all.
Mm-hmm.
And so you sort of follow, at least my idea has been to follow my gut as to what I find most interesting in this direction and this direction, and then figure out a way to put them
Put it
together.
together. Yeah, that's good advice.
That's been my sort of approach to like doing interesting new things, is pick putting new combinations together.
Yeah, yeah, different permutation of what
Yeah.
happened. I wanted to tell you the vignette that came to mind when, so somewhere in the reading was this gentleman, von Neumann,
Von Neumann.
Neumann, sorry,
Yeah.
mispronouncing it.
Johnny von Neumann.
And so he came up in this American Prometheus book because Oppenheimer had invited him to the Institute for Advanced Study, and they go into this little anecdote about how this was just sort of a building, and it was just for scholars to do thinking. They really didn't want it to be like a physical laboratory.
Right.
They didn't want defense work done there. And his whole pitch was he wanted to make it was one of the first computers, but he wanted to make like a human brain.
Yeah.
A mechanical human brain was the
Yeah.
pitch. And the book goes into how they had endless debates. Like, no, we can't let him do that. Like, we don't want hardware here. Like, this is just a place for pure thought. And they ultimately acquiesced because, well, he is trying to make a machine that would develop thought. So that's kind of in line with what they're doing. So they let him get started at this institute.
Yeah.
But there was always this tension with the other scholars that were there. Like, this doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
And they apparently also were very adamant that they didn't want to take government funding for the work. They found like philanthropic funding apparently, and especially defense funding. And they ultimately loosened the reins for that particular project. And over time it outgrew the space, and they had to move him out. And when he moved out, at least in the book, the account is they had a faculty meeting. They're like, yeah, we can never do that again. That was terrible. It's such a pure thought-based place. Sort of an interesting.
It is, and it's actually really it's funny to think about, because von Neumann was one of arguably the greatest mathematical physicists of the 20th century.
They mentioned that.
Who made massive contributions to all sorts of things. And it's funny that after all that, he was the one who was insisting on like not doing pure math, instead doing something really concrete. But so he revolutionized economics, game theory,
right,
a bunch of things in mathematical physics that I don't know much about. But arguably his most important contribution was that the computer that's sitting inside of your cell phone and on your desk, and every computer that's ever been built follows a design that he laid out. It's called the von Neumann architecture, because he's the one who basically took these abstract ideas about how you might compute and actually built a machine. And that was the first machine that he built. Interestingly, although he was interested in replicating human thought, his first real application was solving the partial differential equations needed to predict exactly how the early moments of an atomic explosion would work. So
interesting.
It was to do weapons related hard math.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
It
Sorry we
was
went a
really a
little
pleasure.
over.
No, no.